The American Civil War was over. Enslaved people were now free people. Though the chains of physical bondage were gone, new ways were found to restore the pre-war social order, to keep black people down and subjugated. Racist Jim Crow bylaws, for example, were enacted in the South long before South Africa institutionalized them as apartheid. They ensured that whatever the situation, black folks got the rough end of the stick. The worst housing, the worst schools, the worst jobs, and the worst protection in the face of the law. Right across America, despite what the Founding Fathers had written in the Constitution, it was apparent that not all men were created equal. For black America, the struggle continued. As the 19th turned into the 20th century, three leaders emerged with three very different views on how to tackle racial injustice: Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, and Marcus Garvey. Booker T. Washington believed that the route to equality for millions of black people, fresh out of enslavement, was to learn a trade and therefore make steps towards financial independence. As a child, he dreamed of getting an education like the white children for whom he carried books to school, but the formal education of the black child was out of the reach of all but a chosen few, and in the southern states was completely illegal. Until the Emancipation Proclamation, all the young Booker T could do was peep through the classroom window at his white playmates as they learned reading, writing, and math. When the time came and Abraham Lincoln signed the document declaring all enslaved people free, Washington grasped the opportunity. He walked possibly as many as 400 miles to the school in Hampton from which he would graduate, becoming one of the first African Americans to do so. Here, he would also formulate his influential ideas about the industrialization of the black man and woman. In 1881, Washington established the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a vocational school seeking to give African Americans education of head, hand, and heart, offering moral instruction for the head and heart, and skills such as shoemaking and carpentry for the hands. This Washington sought to provide to a population which owned nothing and had been owned for most, if not all, of their lives. He declared, "We shall prosper in proportion as we learn to dignify and glorify common labor and put brains and skill into the common occupations of life." In 1895, he delivered his most famous speech at the International Exposition in Atlanta. He declared that African Americans should focus on vocational education and should abandon their short-term hopes of equality, addressing those who dreamed of a free black utopia with the refrain, "Cast down your bucket where you are." He went on to warn his mostly white audience that nearly 16 millions of hands will aid you in pulling the load upward, or they will pull against you the load downward. Yet he assured them that they could be confident that they would be surrounded by the most patient, faithful, law-abiding and unresentful people that the world has seen. The classic definition of what Malcom X would later call a house Negro, an accommodating antithesis to the field Negro who resented subjugation. Washington's critics called his speech the Atlanta Compromise and accused him of appeasement by coddling Southern racism and accommodating the suppression and subordination of African Americans. Chief amongst his critics was W.E.B. Du Bois. As early as 1903, W.B. Du Bois had condemned Washington's program of industrial education, conciliation of the South, and submission and silence as to civil and political rights, as well as his assurance to white people that they needn't fear social intermingling. Unlike Washington, Du Bois was born into a free family and later became the first African American to earn a university doctorate. He first encountered the institutionalized racism known as Jim Crow when he went south from his home in New York to attend Fisk University in Tennessee. Undeterred by the prejudice he met, he went on to earn his PhD and thereafter a professorship in history, sociology, and economics at Atlanta University. While Washington's successes came from the grassroots, Du Bois focused on the cream of the crop, the black intelligentsia or talented tenth, whom he believed would raise the rest of the race by creating a path for others to follow. In his book, The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903, Du Bois delivered a blistering attack on Washington's Atlanta speech. Du Bois claimed that Washington opposed the higher training and ambition of black minds, believing that even if there was economic benefit to Washington's methods of preparing black people for industrialization, this benefit could not be defended unless black people had the right to vote, were full citizens, and had civil rights. He also founded the Niagara Movement for social and political emancipation of African Americans. This directly opposed Washington's racial accommodation goals. Its ideals laid the seeds for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, known as the NAACP, founded in 1909. The problem of the 20th century is the color line, a term for racial segregation derived from Frederick Douglass, Du Bois would state at its dawn. He then embarked on a mission to promote Pan-Africanism as a solution to the new century's problem. Du Bois led with an international mindset, but back in the United States, many black people were in search of an alternative Pan-Africanist leader who spoke to them at the grassroots. Marcus Garvey was described by Du Bois as the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race in America and in the world. Born in Jamaica but based in Harlem, he began publishing The Negro World in 1918, a weekly paper spreading his form of Pan-Africanism known as Garveyism with the mantra, "Up, you mighty race. Accomplish what you will."
We believe that the time has come to unite these 400 million people for the one common purpose of bettering their condition.
Garveyism's militant black nationalism saw the answer to the color line as complete separation from white people. To achieve this, he launched a fleet of ships, the Black Star Line, funded by subscription, to repatriate passengers from America to Africa, where they could govern themselves as part of the majority population. In 1922, the Black Star Line failed. The federal government investigated Garvey and found him guilty of mail fraud. He received the maximum sentence, a $1,000 fine and 5 years in jail. Many believed that the judgment against him was an indication of government concern about his influence. Just as there had been tension between Washington and Dubois, so a parallel antipathy arose between Dubois and Garvey. Increasingly, African Americans were faced with the stark choice between Dubois' top-down approach of intellectuals leading the masses and Garvey's undiminishing back to Africa rhetoric. Only a few selfish members of the Negro race believe in the social amalgamation of black and white, Garvey wrote of Dubois' methods. For Garvey, separation and integration could never be married.
No one remember Paul Marcus Garvey. No one remember Paul Marcus Garvey.
For Garvey, separatism was paramount, even if it meant collaborating with white separatists who also wanted a separation of white and black. Despite the controversies, Garvey is celebrated today for encouraging a sense of pride and self-worth in the African diaspora. His philosophy and opinions strongly influenced the Nation of Islam, Malcom X, and black leaders the world over. They were the inspiration for Stokely Carmichael's Black is Beautiful battle cry of the 1960s. There was no shortage of protest movements for African Americans to join in the early 20th century. The problem was deciding which of the opposing leaders to align with. Would the next generation of civil rights leaders find more opportunity to agree? As George Floyd's death has shown, an extrajudicial killing in broad daylight, in full view, has the power to spark a worldwide protest. In 1955, the lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Till would ignite the next wave of the civil rights movement in America. In August, while staying with his cousins in Mississippi, Emmett Till was accused of offending a 21-year-old white woman, Carol Bryant, in her family's grocery store. Later, in the middle of the night, Bryant's husband and half-brother abducted Till and shot and tortured him, leaving his body to sink in the Tallahatchie River. 3 days later, Till's 12-year-old cousin, who was a witness to the abduction, identified the ring on the mutilated body, a memento of Emmett Till's father, Louis, that had been handed down. Despite efforts to prevent her, Emmett's mother, Mamie Till, insisted on her son lying in state in an open casket. Thousands lined the streets to pay their respects. What they saw would stay with them forever. In court, Carol Bryant testified against the dead boy. 62 years later, she finally admitted that she had made up the story that would end in his brutal murder. Roy Bryant and J.W. Milan were acquitted, despite an extraordinarily brave testimony by Till's grandfather Moses Wright, identifying the culprits. "Thou he said, pointing to the men who had abducted his grandson. It may have been the first time that a black man had stood in open court in the South accusing a white man of a crime. His supporters rushed him out of the courthouse, fearing severe consequences, and helped him escape to the north to a new life. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the two defendants were found not guilty. The all-white jury took just 67 minutes to reach its verdict. "100 days after Emmett Till was lynched, in December 1955, Rosa Parks was to initiate the year-long Montgomery bus boycott. She would later become known as the First Lady of Civil Rights and the Mother of the Freedom Movement. On December the 1st, after a full day of work, Parks, a seamstress at a department store in Montgomery, Alabama, and a secretary for the local branch of the NAACP, boarded a bus, paid her fare, sat in an empty seat in the first row in the colored section and the rear reserved for black passengers. During the course of the journey, all of the white-only seats filled up. When the bus stopped at the Empire Theatre, several white passengers boarded, prompting the driver to move the colored section sign behind Parks and demand that she give up her seat for the white passengers. Parks refused to move. She thought about it, but then she thought of Emmett Till and just couldn't do it. She was arrested, charged with a violation of the city's segregation law, and jailed. In the wake of Parks' defiant actions, a movement emerged seeking to boycott the buses of Montgomery. The Montgomery Improvement Association was founded to organize the boycott and rally the community.
What immediate results do you hope to achieve?
Well, we hope to achieve equal rights with any human being before us. That's what we are working for.
For several weeks now, we, the Negro citizens of Montgomery, have been involved in a non-violent protest against the injustices which we have experienced on the buses for a number of years.
The year-long boycott would finally see success in December 1956. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. rose to prominence following Rosa Parks' act of defiance. The Montgomery Improvement Association sought him out to become its leader, and the success of the boycott brought him national recognition. Today, he's remembered as an icon of non-violent resistance, but he was not wholly sold on the doctrine when he joined the bus boycott. His initial response to increasing threats of violence against him was to apply for a gun license to protect himself and his family. His application was rejected.
At times I am rather soft and maybe a little gentle, but I have strongly advocated direct action.
One night, he received a particularly threatening phone call. He feared for the safety of his wife and daughter and was ready to give up leadership of the boycott. But how could he leave without it looking like capitulation? He turned, as he often did, to God, who apparently spoke to him, saying, "Stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and lo, I will be with you always." After that, I was ready to face anything, he said. 3 nights later, King's house was bombed. When he stood by what was left of his home, he calmly declared, "We can't solve this problem through retaliatory violence. We must meet violence with non-violence."
We are depending on moral and spiritual forces, using the method of passive resistance.
For King, love was the most powerful weapon in the world, and non-violence was love expressed politically.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
King's 1963 March on Washington saw him deliver his widely renowned "I Have a Dream" speech, today considered one of the most powerful statements of the civil rights movement. But at the time, it faced criticism. Malcom X was one of King's most powerful critics. Whoever heard of angry revolutionists swinging their bare feet together with oppressors in lily pad pools, with gospels and guitars and "I Have a Dream" speeches, he would say? Contrary to King, Malcolm X believed in pursuing freedom by any means necessary, as he declared at the founding rally of his newly formed Organization of Afro-American Unity a year after King's I Have a Dream speech.
By any means necessary. By whatever means is necessary to bring about complete respect and recognition of the 22 million black people in America as human beings. That's what we're for. That's what we're dedicated to.
Their methods may have differed, but Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were not the sworn enemies the press portrayed them to be. They were in agreement in their goals, equality for African Americans. When they finally met in 1964, after one of King's meetings, they greeted each other warmly and respectfully. The real animosity was between Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, the radical African American Muslim group that he had been a member of, but with whom he had fallen out acrimoniously. He had many enemies, and in the course of the next year would pay with his life. On 21st of February 1965, he prepared to address a large audience at the Audubon Ballroom in New York. Malcolm X was gunned down. He was only 39 years old. 3 years later, when he was also 39 years old, Martin Luther King was shot dead on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. At the time of Malcolm X's death, his political perspectives and King's were converging. Malcolm was becoming more conciliatory and King gradually more militant. Their joint legacy remains that, in pursuing equal rights and justice, neither man was afraid of facing death. Stokely Carmichael was one of many young black students who were torn between the non-violence doctrine of Martin Luther King and the militancy of Malcolm X's by any means necessary. Initially, he aligned himself with Reverend King and took part in what were known as freedom rides, bus journeys that defied the segregation of interstate travel. But change was slow in coming, and Carmichael eventually became frustrated. By the time he was elected national chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he had lost faith in following King down the nonviolent path. The committee and its students were about to get radical.
This country knows what power is. It knows it very well. And it knows what black power is because it's deprived black people of it for 400 years. So it knows what black power is. If we had said Negro power, nobody would get scared. Everybody would support it. If we said power for colored people, everybody'd be for that. But it is the word black. It is the word black that bothers people in this country, and that's their problem, not mine. Their problem.
By the late 1960s, a black power movement had formed and was gaining prominence. Many of its ideas were influenced by Malcolm's criticism of King's peaceful methods.
Now we have two psychological battles that we're fighting against white folks. We won one. They told us that we should hate Malcolm X. We dumped that, thank God.
When Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965, new organizations supporting black power were formed. By 1968, Carmichael had distanced himself from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and had joined the Black Panther Party.
We will work to consolidate our power. We will work to get more people elected who will speak for us.
Just as Colin Kaepernick's taking the knee has echoed in Britain, so other past forms of resistance have resonated across the Atlantic. In 1963, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks' Montgomery bus boycott 8 years earlier had its parallel in Bristol, in the west of England. The Bristol bus boycott was led by the city's first black youth officer, Paul Stephenson. Stephenson had established that the Bristol Omnibus Company was operating a colour bar, as it was known then, in the employment of its personnel. Inspired by what happened in Alabama 8 years earlier, a Bristol bus boycott was organised. It took just 60 days to succeed. On the 28th of August 1963, the same day Martin Luther King delivered his historic I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C., the Bristol boycott achieved its aim, and later that year, Regbit Singh became the city's first non-white bus conductor. In the early 1970s, Stephenson moved to London to work for the Commission for Racial Equality. While in London, he crossed paths with Muhammad Ali. The two would spark a budding friendship and go on to establish a charity for underprivileged children together. It aimed to increase participation in more inaccessible sports such as angling and tennis to help promote self-confidence and develop interaction between different racial groups in poorer areas. Muhammad Ali's boxing career took a turn towards social activism in 1966 when he refused to be drafted into the military, publicly declaring his opposition to the Vietnam War. Ali aligned himself with movements that criticized the war and the draft, a system of conscription that drew mainly from minorities and working-class whites. He was arrested for such opposition, stripped of his boxing titles, and systematically denied a boxing license in every state. Undeterred, he spread his views globally and gave a particularly memorable performance in a BBC interview.
And I always ask my mother, I said, Mother, how come is everything white? I said, why is Jesus white with blonde hair and blue eyes? Even the angels. I said, Mother, when we die, do we go to heaven? She said, naturally we go to heaven. I said, well, what happened to all the black angels when they took the pictures? Everything was white, Santa Claus was white, and everything bad was black. The little ugly duckling was the black duck, and the black cat was the bad luck, and if I threaten you, I'm gonna blackmail you. I said, Mama, why don't they call it white male? They lied too. I was always curious, and this is when I knew something was wrong.
Muhammad Ali was not the only sportsman to pave the way for Colin Kaepernick. In the 1968 Mexico Olympics, two African-American athletes, Tommie Smith and John Carlos, made history. When the US national anthem began to play at the 200-meter final, as Smith and Carlos stood on the podium, in an act that would completely change their lives, they bowed their heads and each raised a black-gloved fist. As they left the podium, they were booed by the crowd. The image of their salute would become front-page news around the world. Smith explained the protest. If I win, I'm an American, not a black American, but if I did something bad, they would say I'm a Negro. We are black and we are proud of being black. Black America will understand what we did tonight. Like Ali and Colin Kaepernick alike, the athletes faced huge backlash. They were both expelled from the games and shunned on their return to America. They couldn't even get a job. In 1967, the year before Smith and Carlos's protest, Stokely Carmichael visited London to speak at a conference. An explosion of black power initiatives in Britain followed. Among British civil rights activist Darcus Howe, who edited the magazine Race Today, rose to particular prominence in 1970 as one of the Mangrove Nine. The Mangrove was a Caribbean restaurant in Notting Hill and an important meeting place for the black community.
On the 9th of August 1970, the Action Committee in Defense of the Mangrove restaurant called a demonstration because that restaurant had been consistently harassed by the police. Ostensibly for drugs, nothing was found. and so the community responded with a demonstration.
150 people marched to the local police station, demanding hands off the Mangrove. Howe and 8 others were tried for incitement to riot. They became known as the Mangrove 9.
Darcus out of jail. Race today cannot fail.
After a trial lasting 55 days, all were cleared of the charge of incitement to riot. The trial marked the first judicial acknowledgement of racial prejudice in the Metropolitan Police.
Him stand up in the court like a mighty lion. Him stand up in the court like a man of iron. Darcus out of jail.
What you say?
Race today cannot fail.
How you mean?
Darcus out of jail. The people's will must prevail.
My terms, that experience is one which could be easily described as brutal, harassing, and generally repressive.
Howe's activism would also reach recognition when he organised a Black People's Day of Action in 1981, following police inadequacy and bias dealing with the New Cross fire, in which 13 young black people were killed. One survivor took his own life 2 years later. 20,000 people marched for 8 hours from Deptford to Hyde Park, carrying placards which read, 13 dead and nothing said, and no police cover-up.
They want to defend you, yes, but in defending you, they will also have to assist the judge to camouflage the entire situation of police brutality in this country.
Under the 1948 Nationalities Act, which created the status of citizen of the United Kingdom and colonies, 10,000 people emigrated to the UK from the Caribbean colonies, promised prosperity as Britain rebuilt after the Second World War. And so, on June the 22nd, 1948, 500 migrants arrived from the Caribbean at Tilbury Docks in Essex on board the Empire Windrush. The Windrush generation. Paulette Wilson was one member of this generation. The new citizens' passports were stamped with indefinite leave to remain, and children were accounted for under their parents' documents. Yet in 2012, the hostile environment immigration policy would make it as difficult as possible for people without leave to remain to stay in the UK. Included in this were threats to deport people from Commonwealth territories who had arrived in the UK before 1973, like the Windrush generation. Paulette Wilson had travelled to the UK legally under encouragement from the British government, but in 2016 she received a letter informing her that she was an immigration offender and needed to take immediate steps to return to Jamaica, a country she had not been to in over half a century. Wilson was arrested twice and detained in immigration removal centres. Only after a last-minute intervention by her MP was her deportation prevented.
Going into detention centre is not nice. You're seeing people in wheelchairs, on walking stick, old people, you know, and you're thinking to yourself, well, what's going to happen to them when they go back to their own countries and like. When I think about it, it just brings heartache. I don't want to talk about it anymore. It just brings... Sorry.
Wilson took decisive action and went to the Guardian newspaper to publicly speak out about her wrongful arrest and detention. This courageous step encouraged dozens of other people to come forward and tell how they'd been wrongly detained, or worse, removed from the UK. The affair would become known as the Windrush Scandal. In the second half of the 20th century, Angela Davis was to become one of America's biggest feminist and anti-racist icons. In 1970, she had a life-changing experience that would inform the direction of her activism forever. Early that year, 3 African-American inmates, the Soledad brothers as they became known, were charged with the murder of a white prison guard at California's Soledad prison. In response, the heavily armed 17-year-old student Jonathan Jackson, whose brother George was one of the Soledad 3, gained control of a courtroom in California. When he tried to take hostages from the courtroom, a shootout ensued, and the judge, 2 convicts, and Jackson himself were killed. When it was discovered that Angela Davis, a university academic, had owned several of the firearms used in the attack, including the one that had been used to shoot the judge, Davis was charged with aggravated kidnapping and first-degree murder in the death of Judge Harold Haley. A massive attempt to find and arrest the 25-year-old Davis began. The FBI listed her on the 10 most wanted fugitives list. Davis went into hiding, but was captured 2 months later.
The repression has already run its course because the state has succeeded in silencing, more or less, sisters and brothers who are leaders in our struggle.
Across America, thousands of people began organizing a movement to gain her release. Hundreds of local committees in the United States and overseas worked to free her from prison. Davis was incarcerated for 16 months before the state allowed her release on bail from county jail. In June 1972, an all-white jury concluded that ownership of the guns was insufficient evidence of her role in the plot, returning a verdict of not guilty. Davis had already been concerned about conditions in prisons, but as she got to know what it was like to be an inmate herself, she developed a much stronger interest in prison reform and abolition. In 1997, Davis co-founded Critical Resistance, an organization working to build an international movement, challenging the belief that caging and controlling people makes society safe. Today, she's recognized as one of the world's most eminent black intellectuals and travels the world on sellout tours in her continued fight for black lives, women, and prison reform.
There's this myth that black people did not resist until Watts or until Malcolm or until the Black Panther Party. It's just not true.
Maya Angelou was the unofficial poet laureate to Presidents Clinton and Obama. In 1969, she began writing I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. It would be the first of her 7 autobiographies, public account of her experience as a black woman growing up in St. Louis. It uses the power of language to navigate a confusing and oppressive world for women of color.
All I'm trying to say, or what the main thesis is, human beings are more alike than we are unalike.
Angelou continued to rise in fame and in 1993 took to one of the biggest stages in the world. At the first inauguration of Bill Clinton, she recited her poem, On the Pulse of the Morning.
You, the Ashanti, the Yoruba, the Kru, bought, sold, stolen, arriving on a nightmare, praying for a dream. Here, root yourselves beside me. I am that tree planted by the river which will not be moved. I the rock, I the river, I the tree, I am yours. Your passages have been paid. Lift up your faces. You have a piercing need for this bright morning dawning for you. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again.
16 years after Angelou performed her poem at Clinton's inauguration, the very same stage would see the inauguration of the first African-American Commander-in-Chief of the United States, President Barack Obama. Progression and regression proved themselves to thrive in the same moment. During Obama's presidential campaign and throughout his presidency, there was excessive and seemingly never-ending discussion about his legitimacy as an American. Those who opposed him alleged his published birth certificate was a forgery and that Obama's actual birthplace was not Hawaii but Kenya, which would make him ineligible to be President of the United States.
I'm confident that the American people can come together and solve these problems. We always have. But we're not going to be able to do it if we are distracted. We're not going to be able to do it if we spend time vilifying each other. We're not going to be able to do it if we just make stuff up and pretend that facts are not facts. We're not going to be able to solve our problems if we get distracted by sideshows and carnival barkers.
In 2008, prior to being elected, Obama released his official Hawaiian birth certificate. Further conspiracies prompted his campaign to release the full form of his birth certificate in 2011. Gallup polls conducted in 2010 before its release showed that 25% of Americans doubted that Obama had been born in the United States. After the certificate was released in 2011, 13% of Americans still doubted Obama's Americanness, including 23% of Republicans.
I know that there's going to be a segment of people for which, no matter what we put out, this issue will not be put to rest. But I'm speaking to the vast majority of the American people, as well as to the press. We do not have time for this kind of silliness. We got better stuff to do.
Today, many Americans still wonder when change, real change, not just symbolic change, is gonna come. From Nanny of the Maroons to Colin Kaepernick, the story of resistance to racial oppression and discrimination against black people is centuries old and continues today. Through the incredible bravery of individuals, many of whom paid with their lives, and the struggle of their supporters, this story will never be forgotten and will inspire future generations as they learn why we take the knee, where it comes from, and the giants on whose shoulders this symbol stands.